Mercedes just dominated the very first race of the 2026 Formula One season. But only hours later, the celebration may have turned into the beginning of a serious investigation. At the Australian Grand Prix, George Russell took pole position. Then on Sunday, he controlled the race and crossed the finish line in first place. Right behind him, Kimi Antonelli secured second. A dominant Mercedes 1-2 finish in the opening race of the new era. But here is where the story suddenly becomes much bigger. After the race, several Formula One teams began analyzing the performance data from Melbourne. And according to multiple reports inside the paddock, what they claim to have discovered has triggered new questions about the Mercedes power unit. Questions big enough that the governing body is now taking a much closer look. Because some engineers believe the Mercedes system may be deploying electrical energy far more efficiently than any other team on the grid. An advantage that, according to several analysts, could be worth the equivalent of nearly 30 horsepower during key acceleration moments. In modern Formula One, that kind of advantage can completely change the competitive order of the entire championship. Which is why rival teams are now pushing for deeper technical scrutiny. And if what they believe turns out to be true, the dominant Mercedes victory we just saw in Australia might not simply be remembered as the first win of the season. It could become the moment when the biggest technical controversy of the 2026 championship began. So the real question now is not who won the Australian Grand Prix. The real question is this: did Mercedes simply build the best car of the new era? Or did rival teams just uncover something hidden inside the regulations that could change everything? Because once you see the detail that triggered this investigation, the Mercedes victory in Melbourne may start to look very different. The first race of the 2026 season was supposed to give us an early clue about the new competitive order in Formula One. But what happened in Australia may have revealed something much bigger. Because from the very first session in Melbourne, the Mercedes W17 immediately caught the attention of the entire paddock. The car looked calm, balanced, and incredibly efficient. During practice, George Russell was already setting the pace. Lap after lap, the Mercedes seemed comfortable on the Albert Park circuit. But the moment that truly made engineers across the paddock stop and look closer came during the final practice session. Russell delivered a lap more than 0.6 faster than the closest Ferrari. In modern Formula One, that kind of gap is massive. Especially at the beginning of a completely new regulation era. Usually, when the rules change this dramatically, the first race is chaotic. Teams arrive with different concepts. Engineers are still trying to understand their new systems. And the field is normally separated by only a few tenths of a second. But Mercedes looked unusually prepared. And qualifying confirmed that impression. George Russell delivered a stunning lap to secure pole position for the Australian Grand Prix. The Mercedes looked planted through the fast sections of the circuit. But what really impressed the engineers watching the data was the way the car accelerated out of slow corners. Every time Russell exited a turn, the car seemed to surge forward with remarkable efficiency. And it was not just Russell. Right behind him on the grid was his teammate Kimi Antonelli. The young Italian produced a brilliant lap of his own, securing second place and locking out the entire front row for Mercedes. At that moment, the first serious questions began to appear in rival garages. Because when one team dominates qualifying at the very first race of a new regulation cycle, it usually means they have discovered something important. Not necessarily something illegal, but something clever. A better way of extracting performance from the rules. And the race on Sunday only added more intrigue to the story. Ironically, the start of the race did not go perfectly for Mercedes. Both Russell and Antonelli struggled when the lights went out. Charles Leclerc reacted faster and managed to take the lead into the first corner for Ferrari. For several laps, the Ferrari and the Mercedes fought aggressively at the front of the field. It quickly became clear that the new 2026 hybrid systems had changed the way drivers could attack and defend. Energy deployment suddenly became one of the most important weapons in the race. Every time Russell activated the attack mode of the power unit, the Mercedes gained impressive acceleration down the straight. But using that extra power also drained the battery more quickly, allowing Leclerc to counterattack when the Mercedes' energy level dropped. It was a fascinating tactical battle. For a moment, it even looked like Ferrari might have the pace to challenge for the win. But then the race took a decisive turn. A virtual safety car appeared after another car stopped on track. Mercedes reacted immediately. Both drivers entered the pits at exactly the right moment. It was a perfectly executed double pit stop that allowed them to switch to fresh tires while losing almost no time relative to the rest of the field. Ferrari chose a different strategy and stayed out on track. But that decision ultimately allowed Mercedes to take control of the race. Once Russell returned to the front, the outcome began to look inevitable. He managed the tires carefully. He controlled the pace. And he maintained a stable gap to the cars behind him. Lap after lap, the Mercedes looked calm and efficient at the front of the field. When the checkered flag finally appeared, Russell crossed the finish line in first place. Antonelli followed him home in second. A dominant 1-2 finish for Mercedes in the opening race of the 2026 season. On paper, it looked like the perfect start to a championship campaign. But behind the scenes, several engineers had already started studying something much more specific in the data. Not the strategy. Not the tires. But the way the Mercedes power unit was delivering its electrical energy during acceleration. And what they believe they saw in that data is exactly what has now triggered the next stage of this story. Because according to several teams inside the paddock, the Mercedes system might be operating with a level of efficiency that nobody else has yet managed to achieve. And if that suspicion turns out to be correct, the dominant performance we just witnessed in Australia might only be the beginning of a much bigger battle happening behind the scenes. But the real tension surrounding Mercedes did not begin during the race. It began after the race was over. Because once the cars returned to the garages in Melbourne, engineers across the paddock finally gained access to the full performance data from the weekend. And in modern Formula One, that data reveals everything. Top speeds. Energy deployment curves. Acceleration traces out of every corner. Even the smallest difference between two cars can be detected when engineers start comparing telemetry. And that is exactly when several teams noticed something unusual. The Mercedes power unit seemed to behave differently during acceleration phases. Not dramatically. Not in a way that immediately suggests something illegal. But enough to raise serious questions among rival engineers. Because under the 2026 regulations, the balance of power inside a Formula One car has changed dramatically. The internal combustion engine now produces less of the total power than in previous years. Instead, electrical deployment plays a much larger role in performance. That means every team has spent years trying to perfect the same engineering challenge. How to release electrical energy at the perfect moment. How to maintain strong acceleration without draining the battery too quickly. And how to recover enough energy during braking to repeat that process again and again during a lap. It is an incredibly delicate balance. If a team deploys too much electrical energy too early, the battery becomes empty before the end of the straight. If they deploy too cautiously, the car simply becomes slower than its rivals. But according to several engineers studying the race data from Australia, the Mercedes system appears to have found a very efficient solution to that problem. The car seems able to deliver powerful bursts of electrical energy without suffering the same level of battery depletion seen on other cars. In simple terms, the Mercedes appears to accelerate harder while still maintaining enough energy for the next straight. That kind of efficiency is extremely difficult to achieve. And that is exactly why the discovery immediately attracted attention across the paddock. Some analysts inside Formula One now believe the advantage could be equivalent to nearly 30 additional horsepower during certain acceleration phases. In a sport where a tenth of a second can decide positions, that kind of gain is enormous.